The paper between Laura Regina Mendez's fingers isn't just a document. It's the sound of a door slamming in the face of a daughter who just buried her father. Otavio Mendez will is right there, on the black oak table, but Laura's name has been swept from the lines as if she were a typo needing correction. She doesn't cry. The shock has paralyzed her tear ducts. In the reflection of the window pane, she sees Dr. Arnaldo Silveira adjust his glasses, avoiding eye contact, while the air conditioning blows a polar breath that makes the hairs on Laura's arms stand up. She turns to the camera, eyes bloodshot, and the question escapes like a sharp whisper. What would you do if you discovered your entire life was funded by a lie? Before the gears of this betrayal crush what's left of Laura's sanity, you need to decide if you want to descend into this grave with her. Subscribe now to follow every fragment of this painful discovery and don't allow the truth to be buried. Comment below. Would you forgive a mother who hid a monster in the closet for 30 years? Be careful what you answer. Silence might be your greatest enemy today. The office smells of old paper and the excessively sweet perfume of Helena Mendez, who remains seated in the corner of the room, her trembling hands hidden beneath black lace gloves. Laura stares at the document once more. Where her name and her share of Otavio's fortune should have been written, there is emptiness. A legal vacuum. Dr. Arnaldo clears his throat, the sound echoing off the marble walls like a gunshot. He slides a gray folder toward Laura. Inside, there isn't just the disinheritance, but photos. Photos of Helena with a man Laura learned to hate since birth, her father's greatest rival. Cold sweat trickles down the back of Laura's neck. She realizes that mourning was a luxury she can no longer afford. Otavio's death wasn't the end of a life. It was the start of a collapse. Every penny that paid for her schools, every piece of jewelry on her mother's neck, every brick of the mansion where she grew up. Everything is stained by a secret that is now beginning to bleed before her eyes. She looks at Helena, who shifts her gaze to the Persian rug, and Laura understands. The war isn't about money anymore. It's about survival. The sky over Consolaco Cemetery wasn't just gray. It was an oppressive mass of lead that seemed to descend upon Laura's shoulders, crushing any remnant of air in her lungs. The rain, fine and persistent, did not purify. It only transformed the churned earth into a black, sticky mud that stained the hem of Helena's silk dress, the widow who remained standing erect, like a marble statue sculpted by the ice itself. Laura felt the cold infiltrate her bones, but her mother's icy indifference bothered her far more than the dampness. She observed Helena in profile. The French lace veil concealed part of the woman's face, but couldn't hide the absolute absence of sobs, the non-existent trembling in the gloved hands holding a single white rose. Helena didn't cry for Otavio. She didn't mourn the loss of the man with whom she had shared 30 years of secrets. She seemed, in fact, to be on guard. The sound of drops hitting the dozens of black umbrellas created a rhythmic cacophony, a hypnotic drumming that accompanied the celebrant's monotone voice. Laura closed her eyes for a second, trying to evoke the image of Otavio, the father who took her for ice cream, the man who funded her studies abroad, the generous provider. But the image was blurred, distorted by the brutal discovery in the law office. Every penny spent on that life of privilege now burned in her memory like embers. Everything had been built on an abyss of lies. Upon opening her eyes, Laura's gaze wandered over the small crowd of mourning figures, businessmen with rehearsed expressions of sorrow, and women with discreet jewelry that gleamed under the dull light of day. It was then that she saw him. Away from the main group, leaning against an imposing mausoleum of angels decapitated by time, stood Ricardo. He wasn't carrying an umbrella. Water ran down his angular face, soaking his impeccably tailored jacket, but he didn't seem to care. Ricardo was the personification of the danger Otavio had always mentioned in fearful whispers during business dinners. He was the rival, the predator who had tried to dismantle Otavio's empire for decades. His presence there was a profanation. Laura felt a wave of indignation rise in her chest. What was that man doing here? Had he come to savor the final victory over his enemy's corpse? She made a move to walk toward him, to confront that audacity, but she felt Helena's hand grip her wrist with disproportionate force. "Stay where you are, Laura." Helena's voice was a sibilant whisper, loaded with an authority that brooked no reply. Laura looked at her mother, and what she saw left her paralyzed. Helena wasn't looking at the coffin that was beginning to slowly descend into the grave. She was looking directly at Ricardo. There was no hatred in her eyes. No surprise. There was a mute recognition, an invisible communication that crossed the cemetery like a high-tension wire. Ricardo slightly inclined his head, an almost imperceptible greeting, and a chilling, fleeting smile crossed his lips before he turned and disappeared among the gravestones, merging with the fog and the rain. Laura's stomach churned. Helena's silence in the presence of her father's greatest enemy wasn't the silence of shock. It was the silence of complicity. The spark of distrust, which had previously been just an uncomfortable smoke in the back of her mind, exploded into a vivid flame. What would you do if you discovered your entire life was funded by a lie? She had asked herself before. Now, the question changed, becoming darker, more visceral. What would you do if you discovered that the people who were supposed to protect you are the architects of your ruin? Ottavio's coffin hit the bottom of the grave with a dull, final, and absolute thump. Helena released the white rose. The flower fell into the mud, quickly covered by the first shovel of dirt tossed by the gravedigger. The sound of earth hitting wood was the sound of doors closing. Laura looked at Helena's hands. They were clean, dry, despite the rain. While everyone around dispersed, fleeing the cold and the death, Laura remained motionless. She realized that the will that had erased her from the inheritance was only the first layer of a rotten onion she would have to peel with her own hands, even if it meant cutting herself deeply in the process. The war wasn't just for survival. It was for a truth that no one there seemed to want her to know. And, as the rain washed Ottavio's name on the cold stone, Laura knew that the Real burial had not yet happened. She would bury the past, but first, she would make it bleed. The creak of the mansion library's double oak doors sounded like the ceiling of a tomb. The air inside was dense, saturated by the smell of old leather, piped tobacco that time had failed to erase, and the chilling, floral perfume emanating from Helena. Laura felt her stomach knotted, a persistent nausea that had accompanied her since the cemetery. She sat in the burgundy velvet armchair, the same one where she had so often seen Ottavio read his financial reports, but now the furniture felt hostile, as if rejecting her. Across from them, Dr. Arnaldo seemed to have aged 10 years in just a few hours. He adjusted his reading glasses on his hooked nose, his hands trembling as he fumbled with the envelope sealed with red wax. The sound of the paper being torn was, for Laura, more violent than the blast of a gunshot. "We are here for the fulfillment of Ottavio's last wishes," Arnaldo began, his voice muffled by formality and a sadness he unsuccessfully tried to conceal. He was very specific about the immediate reading after the burial. Helena didn't move. She remained standing near the window, overlooking the now shadow-draped garden. Her posture was impeccable, her long, pale fingers intertwined over her abdomen, her eyes fixed on an invisible spot on the bookshelf. She was a marble statue amidst Laura's emotional chaos. Dr. Arnaldo began the reading. The first paragraphs were filled with arid legal terms, descriptions of real estate, stocks, and rural properties. Laura heard the sound of the words, but the meaning seemed to float away. She could only think of her father's last look, the distance that had grown between them in recent years, the silence that had become an abyss. And as for the principal residence and the liquid assets accounts, Arnaldo paused, glancing at Laura before lowering his eyes back to the document. "I determined that they be fully transferred to the administration of the Phoenix Foundation." The silence that followed was absolute, interrupted only by the rhythmic and relentless ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner of the room. Laura frowned, her heart accelerating. "Phoenix Foundation?" Laura interrupted, her voice coming out thinner than she intended. "Arnaldo, what foundation is this? My father never mentioned any institution by that name." The lawyer cleared his throat, the discomfort evident in every line of his face. "It is a private philanthropic entity, Laura. It was constituted in absolute secrecy about 2 years ago. And my share?" The question escaped Laura's lips before she could process her own urgency. "The company's, the family legacy, what is left for me?" Arnaldo sighed, a heavy sound that seemed to suck the oxygen from the room. He resumed the reading, the words now falling like hammer blows upon a coffin. "To my daughter, Laura, I leave the symbolic amount stipulated by law as the minimum legal portion, to be paid in monthly installments, on the condition that she does not interfere with the management of the Phoenix Foundation. I also leave her my personal diary from 1998, with the hope that, through the words, she may find the understanding that life did not allow us to achieve. Laura felt the floor drop out from under her. It wasn't just the money, it was the message. To be disinherited from the majority of the fortune in favor of an unknown organization was a public declaration of lack of love. It was the final proof that Ottavio had died harboring a deep resentment, a bitterness he preferred to take to the grave and transform into an eternal punishment for his daughter. "He took everything from me," Laura whispered, her hands gripping the arms of the armchair until her knuckles turned white. "He erased me from his own life." She looked at Helena, expecting to find some flash of surprise, indignation, or even a trace of pity. But her mother remained motionless. The only sign of life in Helena was the slight movement of her chest as she breathed. "You knew about this, didn't you?" Laura accused, standing up, her legs unsteady. "You helped him do this, Helena." Helena finally turned her face. Her eyes were two pools of black ice. "Your father was a man of rigid principles, Laura. He rewarded loyalty and punished negligence. You chose your paths long before he chose this well." "Negligence? I was his daughter," Laura shouted, tears finally overflowing, hot and bitter. "Did he hate me that much? Enough to leave me scraps and hand the family empire over to strangers?" "The Phoenix Foundation is not composed of strangers," Arnaldo intervened cautiously, closing the leather folder. "The Foundation's deliberative board has already been named." "Who was on that board?" Laura demanded, wiping her face with the back of her hand, pain giving way to defensive anger. Arnaldo hesitated, looking at Helena as if seeking permission to deliver the final blow. Helena merely nodded, an almost imperceptible movement. "The Foundation will be presided over by Helena," the lawyer said, "and the vice president, with plenary decision-making power in her absence, is Mr. Ricardo." Ricardo's name echoed in the library like a profanation. The rival, the man Ottavio had always described as a dangerous shadow, now held the keys to the kingdom. Laura felt a violent wave of nausea. Her father's betrayal was complete. He had not only disinherited her, he had handed her, along with everything they built, into the hands of the enemy, under the tutelage of a mother who seemed to celebrate her ruin. The library, with its shelves full of knowledge and history, now felt like a prison cell. Laura looked at the 1998 diary Arnaldo extended to her, a small volume with a worn leather cover. It was the only remnant of affection, or perhaps the last piece of a perverse puzzle. "Leave," Helena said, her voice low and sharp. "Arnaldo and I have administrative details to handle. You received what your father thought you deserved, Laura. Nothing more, nothing less." Laura took the diary with trembling hands and walked toward the door. Each step weighed as if she were carrying Ottavio's own coffin on her back. As she left, she didn't look back, but felt Helena's cold gaze burning the nape of her neck. The true burial, she realized now, had not been at the cemetery. It had been right there, between the will and her mother's silence. But, as she pressed the diary against her chest, a spark of hatred began to burn where there had only been pain before. If Ottavio wanted her to bleed, he would get his wish, but she wouldn't bleed alone. The silence in the Valle mansion wasn't emptiness. It was a dense, almost solid substance that clung to Laura's skin like a shroud. While Dr. Arnaldo's footsteps echoed distantly down the marble corridor, carrying with them the bureaucratic weight of a disinherited life, Laura did not move toward the exit. Her eyes, burning from a mixture of humiliation and cold fury, fixed on the imposing solid oak door at the end of the east corridor. Ottavio's office. That was the sanctuary she was rarely allowed to enter while he was alive. Now, with the patriarch's body resting under 7 feet of cold earth, the door looked like a final challenge. Without hesitation, she turned the knob. It was locked. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. Even dead, Ottavio tried to keep his secrets under lock and key. Laura searched her purse for the bunch of keys she had stolen from Helena's nightstand that morning, while her stepmother was drowning in her catatonic muteness. The third key grated, but gave way. As she opened the door, the stagnant air hit her like a punch. The smell of tobacco, the omnipresent rope tobacco that Ottavio insisted on hand-chopping, still permeated the heavy velvet curtains and the shelves housing worn leather volumes. Twilight filtered through the slats of the blinds, drawing streaks of golden dust that danced over the mahogany desk. It was like stepping into a mausoleum of bitter memories. Laura walked to the leather chair where her father had spent decades architecting his fortune and, simultaneously, his own daughter's emotional isolation. She sat down. The leather creaked under her weight, a sound that, for an instant, seemed like Ottavio's sigh of reproach. "Why, Daddy?" she whispered, her nails digging into the armrest. "What did I do to deserve your contempt even after the end?" She began rummaging through the drawers with a maniacal urgency. Export papers, bank statements from accounts she would never see the balance of, receipts for donations to the foundation that now owned her inheritance. Everything seemed irrelevant, too bureaucratic to justify such cruelty in the will. It was in the bottom left drawer, the deepest and seemingly empty one, that something sounded different. As she knocked on the bottom of the drawer to close it, the sound wasn't the dull thud of solid wood, but a hollow, almost metallic click. Laura's heart leaped against her ribs. She removed the drawer completely and flipped it onto the floor. With the tip of a silver letter opener, she forced the edge of the inner lining. The false bottom gave way with a dry snap, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside, there were no gold bars or property deeds. There was only a brown envelope, stained by time, and a small box of faded velvet. Laura picked up the envelope. Her hands were trembling so much she almost tore the paper opening it. What fell out was a black and white photograph, slightly yellowed at the edges by the moisture and neglect of the hiding place. The impact was visual and physical. Laura felt the air rush out of her lungs. In the image, a much younger Helena, hair loose in the wind and a smile of surrender that Laura had never seen on her face, was in the arms of a man. It wasn't Ottavio. It was Ricardo, her father's greatest commercial rival, the man Ottavio had spent his life trying to destroy in courts and auctions. They were on a deserted beach, the sand looking gray under the photo's filter. Ricardo embraced her from behind, his hands intertwined over Helena's abdomen, which looked slightly swollen beneath the light linen dress. On the back of the photo, trembling but unmistakable handwriting traced Laura's fate. Asterisk, our secret in the sand. January of Laura's year. Where everything began and where everything should have stayed. Asterisk. The date coincided exactly with the months preceding Laura's birth. The silence of the office became deafening. Every beat of Laura's heart resonated like a hammer blow on the walls of that room. Ottavio's hatred wasn't just resentment toward a rebellious daughter. It was the venom of a man who had spent 25 years looking at his daughter's face and seeing the living proof of his wife's betrayal with his worst enemy. She wasn't just a disinherited heir. She was, in Ottavio's eyes, a biological mistake, a daily reminder of his humiliation as a man. Laura felt a sudden wave of nausea. The photograph burned in her fingers. She looked at the door, imagining Helena sitting in the living room, maintaining her marble silence. Helena knew. Helena always knew that Ottavio kept that evidence like a sharpened knife, waiting for the moment to deliver the final blow, a blow that would only come when he was no longer here to see the blood run. The tears Laura had held back so fiercely during the will reading finally fell, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of a chilling, cutting understanding. She looked at Ottavio's portrait on the wall, the oil-painted eyes seeming to mock her discovery. "So that's it," she murmured, her voice failing. "I was his punishment, and he made my life his final battlefield." She tucked the photo into her coat pocket. The weight of that paper was greater than any fortune the will could have given her. If Ottavio wanted her to bleed, he had succeeded. But now, Laura had the weapon that could destroy what little remained of the Valle family's immaculate reputation. She stood up, her posture suddenly rigid. Ottavio's office, once a place of mystery and fear, was now just a cold room filled with smoke and lies. She left, locking the door behind her, leaving her father's ghost behind, but taking with her the truth that would ignite what was left of that family. The silence in the house at midnight was not peace, but a heavy static, like the pressure preceding a devastating storm. Laura descended the stairs barefoot, feeling the cold of the wooden floor rise through her legs, but the fire burning in her stomach was enough to ignore any physical discomfort. In her right hand, The piece of photographic paper seemed to weigh tons. It was material proof, a fragment of time that should not exist, a fissure in the reality she called family. When she reached the kitchen, the only source of light was the pale, clinical glare coming from the open refrigerator door. Helena was there, standing like a marble statue worn down by time. She was holding a glass of water, the bluish light accentuating the deep dark circles and expression lines that seemed to have deepened in the last few hours. The monotonous hum of the appliance's motor was the only sound filling the vacuum between the two women. Laura said nothing immediately. She walked to the central granite island and slid the photograph onto the cold surface. The slide of the paper sounded like a gunshot in the absolute silence. Helena slowly lowered her gaze. The moment her eyes met the image of Ricardo, her husband, Laura's father, exchanging caresses with herself on a deserted beach, the world seemed to collapse. The glass slipped from her trembling fingers. The shattering of the crystal against the ceramic floor was a violent event, shards leaping and ricocheting like small blades of light. Water spread, seeping into the grout, but Helena did not move. She seemed to have forgotten how to breathe. 1994. Mother. Laura's voice came out low, hoarse, loaded with a disappointment that bordered on hatred. The year I was born. Helena finally shifted her gaze from the photo to her daughter. Her hands, now empty, began to tremble uncontrollably. She tried to hide them in the folds of her silk robe, but the tremor was visceral, coming from the core of her spine. Laura, you don't understand. Helena's voice was a broken whisper, a pathetic attempt to erect a barrier against the inevitable. That was a lifetime ago. Things that were buried for a reason. Buried? Laura took a step forward, entering the radius of cold light. Her eyes shone with tears she refused to let fall. You and Daddy. You built our house on a cemetery of lies. I looked at you too and saw a solid marriage, a partnership. But this photo says you started when you should still have been strangers. Or worse, when he was still with the other family he swore he never had. Helena shook her head, the movement frantic and erratic. She approached the counter, her fingertips touching the edge of the photograph as if fearing it might burn her. It wasn't supposed to be like this, Helena murmured, denial being her last line of defense. We loved each other. Ricardo and I, we made mistakes, but the love we had for you was real. The love is real, but the origin is a fraud? Laura tasted the bitter bile in the back of her throat. Look at the date, Helena. Look closely. If this photo is from the summer of '94, and I was born in December, you weren't just having an affair. You were planning my existence while he was still sleeping in another woman's bed, while he pretended to be the honorable man everyone thought he was. The visual discomfort of the scene was suffocating. The refrigerator light began to flicker slightly, creating a strobe effect that made Helena's movements seem fragmented, like an old horror movie. The smell of ozone and the cold of the water spread on the floor created an atmosphere of domestic shipwreck. Helena slumped onto one of the tall stools, her face hidden in her hands. The trembling now reached her shoulders. The cry that escaped her was not of remorse, but of someone who had finally been cornered by the truth. He wasn't the saint you projected, Laura, Helena said, her voice suddenly gaining a desperate hardness. Ricardo was a broken man, and I was the person who put the pieces back together. Yes, the betrayal is ancient. It is the foundation of everything you know. Every brick of this house, every trip we took, every childhood memory you hold, everything was paid for with the price of that betrayal. A chilling emptiness expanded in Laura's chest. The revelation wasn't just about an extramarital affair. It was about the realization that her own identity was the fruit of a calculated act of disloyalty. Ricardo's face in the photo, young and smiling, seemed to mock her now. The hero of her childhood was, in fact, an architect of disappointment. Who else knows? Laura asked, her tone now devoid of emotion, which was far more frightening than a scream. Helena lifted her head. Her eyes were red. The mask of perfection she had worn for decades had fallen, revealing a woman exhausted and consumed by guilt. No one, only the shadows that inhabit this office. Helena vaguely pointed upstairs. Your father took the deepest secrets to the grave, but he forgot that the past always leaves tracks. He kept that photo because he couldn't detach himself from the moment it all began. The moment we decided that our desire was worth more than anyone else's life. Laura took the photo back, feeling the texture of the paper between her fingers. She looked at the shards of glass on the floor, gleaming like cruel diamonds under the flickering light. "You didn't just betray a woman or a family," Laura said, her voice cutting like the shards on the floor. "You betrayed me. You raised me in a theater, and now the curtains have dropped." Laura turned her back on her mother, leaving Helena alone in the chilly kitchen, surrounded by broken glass and the rhythmic sound of the refrigerator which, at that moment, sounded like the ticking of a bomb that had finally exploded. As she climbed the stairs, Laura knew that Ricardo's ghost was no longer a comforting presence in her memories, but a dark stain that would never be cleaned. The truth had set the past on fire, and the ashes were only beginning to fall. Helena's car engine rumbled like a wounded animal in the garage, cutting through the funereal silence of the early morning. Laura, standing still in the kitchen over the glass shards that still gleamed under the refrigerator's cold light, felt the impact of her mother's departure in every vertebra. There was no goodbye, just the sound of tires crunching gravel and the vacuum left by a truth that refused to be spoken. Without thinking, driven by desperate inertia, Laura grabbed her own car keys. The steering wheel felt icy, an extension of the cold that had settled in her chest. She kept the lights off until Helena's car gained distance, following the red glare of the taillights as if tracking the blood trail of prey. The destination was a peeling hotel facade, a building that seemed to have been forgotten by time and dignity. The neon sign, with the letters HOTL flashing in a sickly blue, cast intermittent shadows on the damp asphalt. Helena parked erratically, almost mounting the curb. Laura stopped 2 blocks away, her short breath fogging the windshield. Upon entering the hotel bar, the air changed. The smell of tobacco ingrained in the heavy curtains mixed with the acrid odor of cheap cleaning products and spilled gin. Laura slid into a dark niche at the back of the room, shielded by a plastic palm tree whose plastic leaves accumulated a gray layer of dust. The ambient sound was a constant hum. The compressor of an old refrigerator, the clinking of ice in solitary glasses, and the murmur of voices that didn't want to be heard. There she was. Helena sat at a corner table, the amber lighting highlighting the lines of exhaustion and guilt that makeup could no longer hide. Across from her, Ricardo waited. He didn't look like the impeccable businessman Laura knew from family parties. He was disheveled, with his tie knot loose and his eyes bloodshot. "You shouldn't have come." Ricardo's voice reached Laura's ears like a cutting whisper, loaded with an intimacy that made her want to vomit. "She knows, Ricardo." Laura saw the photo. "She knows about us," Helena said, her hands trembling so much she had to intertwine them on the stained table. Ricardo let out a dry laugh, a sound devoid of any humor. He downed the rest of an amber liquid from his glass and slammed the glass onto the wood with contained violence. "Knowing about us is the least of our problems now," he hissed, leaning forward. "The problem is that Ottavio knew too. He always knew, Helena. For years, he watched us as if we were rats in a maze." Laura felt the floor drop out. Her father's name, pronounced by that man in that filthy place, felt like a profanation. She pressed her hands against the torn upholstery of the bench, her nails digging into the synthetic fabric. "The secret he took to the grave," Helena began, her voice catching in a dry sob. "It wasn't a secret, it was a delayed weapon." Ricardo interrupted her, his voice now lower, darker. It wasn't a bureaucratic error or the forgetfulness of a sick man. It was Ottavio's last revenge. He set up every clause to ensure that the moment he stopped breathing, our life would begin to crumble. He left us nothing because he wanted us to devour each other alive over the inheritance that would never come. Helena covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking. The decaying bar seemed to close in on them. Laura observed the scene with cruel clarity. The father she idolized, the kind and silent man, had spent his last months architecting a refined punishment for his wife's and best friend's betrayal. Every diverted penny, every blocked piece of real estate, every legal loophole in the will was a cry of pain from Ottavio, transformed into legal strategy. "He knew you would run to me," Ricardo continued, his voice now tinged with contempt. "He knew that without his money, you would be nothing more than an inconvenient memory to me. Ottavio didn't just disinherit us, Helena. He stripped us bare. He left you with nothing to offer me, and left me with nothing to take from you." The revelation echoed in Laura's mind like a hammer hitting an anvil. Helena's infidelity wasn't a recent adventure. It was an open wound that had rotted the foundation of her home for decades. And her father, in his dignified silence, chose posthumous revenge over confrontation in life. Laura felt overwhelming nausea. The environment, with its flickering light and smell of decay, was the perfect backdrop for the conclusion of that farce. She watched Ricardo stand up, leaving Helena alone at the table, a small, broken figure under the yellow light. He didn't touch her. There was no comfort, only final abandonment. As Ricardo walked past the exit, Laura remained in the shadows, her heart pounding against her ribs like a prisoner trying to escape. She looked at her mother and no longer saw the woman who raised her, but a stranger who had traded family integrity for a love that now revealed itself to be as rotten as the walls of that hotel. The nocturnal pursuit was over, but Laura's true journey was just beginning. The ashes she mentioned before weren't just from the past. They were covering the present, suffocating the oxygen, transforming the love she felt for her father into something complex, dark, and terrifying. Ottavio had won, but the price of his victory was the soul of the daughter he left behind to pick up the wreckage. Marcos's office smelled of reheated coffee and the mold of files that should never have been reopened. It was a claustrophobic space, where the yellow light of a desk lamp fought against the gloom that seemed to sprout from the corners of the room. For Laura, every second inside felt like a compressed eternity. The silence was broken only by the rhythmic hum of an old ceiling fan, whose blades cut through the heavy air as if trying, in vain, to dissipate the tension accumulating between the two. Marcos wasn't just a private detective. He was a ghost from Ottavio's past. His tired eyes, surrounded by deep dark circles, carried the weight of secrets he preferred to have forgotten. He slid a worn leather folder across the scratched oak table, the sound of the friction echoing like thunder in the silent room. Your father wasn't a man of impulse, Laura. Marcos's voice was a hoarse whisper, loaded with a melancholy that made the hairs on Laura's arms stand up. Ottavio planned every step with a watchmaker's precision. But, in the last few days, something changed. He was frantic. Laura felt the cold metal of the chair against her back. She could still hear the echo of the argument between Helena and Ricardo at the hotel bar, the words revenge and secret throbbing in her temple like a persistent migraine. "What did you find, Marcos?" she asked, her voice sounding strange to her own ears, devoid of any emotion other than the absolute fear of the answer. Marcos opened the folder. Inside, copies of official documents and handwritten notes revealed a sinister chronology. The original will, the one that left everything to Helena and guaranteed your future, was altered. Marcos pointed to the stamped date in the upper corner. 3 days. Just 72 hours before Ottavio was found dead in that library armchair. He didn't just change the inheritance clauses. He created a legal maze designed to financially suffocate your mother. Laura leaned forward, the lamp light revealing the tremor in her hands. He knew. She murmured, more to herself than to Marcos. He found out about Ricardo and Helena. He found out much more than an extramarital affair. Laura. Marcos hesitated, his fingers nervously tapping on a still-closed brown envelope. Ottavio sought me out the week of his death. He was paranoid, saying his entire life had been a lie architected under the roof of his own house. He didn't just want a divorce. He wanted Helena's moral annihilation. The detective removed a laboratory form from the envelope, still blank, but with Ottavio's name already filled in the applicant field. The paper seemed to burn under Laura's gaze. He was about to order a DNA test, Marcos revealed, and the weight of those words seemed to suck the oxygen from the room. He was no longer sure if you were his daughter, Laura. The supposed heart attack happened the very night he received the collection kit at home. The kit was never used. It disappeared. Laura's world swayed. The image of Ottavio, the rigid man she had always considered her safe harbor, transformed into that of a relentless judge who, in his last breaths, looked at her and saw only the living proof of a betrayal. The love she felt for him was now stained by the doubt that he would have discarded her as a miscalculation had he lived one more day. "Are you saying that?" Laura's voice failed. "That his death was too convenient?" Marcos sighed, a sound loaded with existential exhaustion. He stood up and walked to the window, observing Laura's distorted reflection in the dirty glass. The medical report says massive heart attack, accumulated stress, pre-existing coronary issues. But the timing, Laura, the timing is heresy. He had the DNA test in his hand and the pin ready to disinherit Helena for good. 3 days later, he's dead and the altered will comes into effect, but in a way that punishes Helena without her being able to contest it without exposing her own dirt. Ottavio left a trail of poisoned breadcrumbs for her to follow. Laura looked at the document on the table. Ottavio's handwriting in the margins was erratic, different from the firm script she knew. There was one annotation in particular, circled several times. Asterisk, blood doesn't lie, but silence kills. Asterisk, did Helena and Ricardo know about the test? Laura asked, the taste of bile rising in her throat. I believe so, Marcos replied, turning to her. And if they knew, Ottavio's heart attack was the biggest stroke of luck in their lives, or the most perfect crime I've ever seen. Laura closed her eyes, but the darkness brought her no peace. She saw the living room of her house, the smell of funeral flowers, Helena's impassive face as the coffin was lowered. The pain of loss was now supplanted by a chilling rage. She had been left behind not as an heiress, but as the wreckage of a war she didn't even know was being fought. Keep digging, Marcos, she ordered, her voice now hardened like tempered steel. I want to know what happened in those last 72 hours. I want to know if my father died of heartbreak or if someone stopped his heart to save their own skin. Marcos nodded, putting the papers away. He knew that by opening that door, Laura would never again be the woman who walked in. She was diving into an abyss of truths that could destroy her, but the glint of determination in her eyes showed she preferred the ashes of truth to the comfort of the lie. The sound of the ceiling fan continued to cut through the air, but now it sounded like the ticking of a time bomb. Ottavio's secret was no longer in the grave. It was alive, breathing, and ready to consume all those who tried to conceal it. The smell of ozone and cheap disinfectant seemed to cling to Laura's throat like invisible soot. Santa Martha Hospital, at that hour of the morning, wasn't a place of healing, but a reinforced concrete mausoleum, where the silence was broken only by the electric hum of fluorescent lamps that flickered rhythmically, like a heart about to stop. Beside her, Marcos walked with professional rigidity, but his eyes, always vigilant, scanned every shadow in the worn linoleum corridors. They shouldn't have been there. Ottavio's death had been declared natural, a fulminating cardiac event that ended a life of success and left a trail of contested inheritances. But the weight in Laura's chest wasn't just grief. It was the corrosive intuition that her father's body had been buried with secrets the earth couldn't digest. Jonas is waiting for us near the maintenance wing, Marcos whispered, his voice barely exceeding the distant noise of a cleaning cart. He's the only one who can access the server without leaving immediate traces. But be quick, Laura. The shift changes in 40 minutes. Laura clutched her purse to her body. Inside, the envelope with the money seemed to weigh tons, a dirty symbol of the need to corrupt the system to reach a truth that should be hers by right. When they found Jonas, a man with slumped shoulders and shifty eyes, the transaction was quick, almost mechanical. There were no words of comfort, just the dry sound of paper changing hands and the metallic click of a security door being unlocked. The monitoring room was small, stuffy, and full of screens that vomited a bluish, sickly light onto the faces of the three. The air there was thin, saturated with the smell of stale coffee and overheated electronics. Jonas typed rapid commands, his trembling fingers hesitating for a second before selecting the date. 3 days before Ottavio's funeral. Intensive care unit hallway, north wing, Jonas murmured. Room 412. Laura felt the blood drain from her extremities. The image on the screen was grainy, bathed in shades of gray and black, but the silhouette of her father's room door was unmistakable. For a few minutes, nothing happened. Just nurses passing, the bureaucratic movement of imminent death. Then, at 2:14 a.m., a figure emerged in the corner of the screen. Laura's heart gave a violent lurch against her ribs. She would recognize that gait anywhere in the world. The rigid posture, the way he adjusted his shirt cuff, the chin slightly raised in a gesture of arrogance that even the hospital environment couldn't break. It was Ricardo. What is he doing there? Laura's voice came out as a dry crackle, devoid of air. He told me he was at a business meeting that night. He swore he only learned about Daddy's worsening condition in the morning. On the screen, Ricardo stopped in front of room 412's door. He didn't look like an afflicted son. There was no desperation in his movements, nor the hesitation of someone about to bid farewell to a loved one. He looked both ways down the corridor with predatory coldness. His eyes, even in the camera's poor resolution, looked like black holes. He entered the room. The minutes that followed were the longest of Laura's life. She dug her nails into her palms, feeling the physical pain as an anchor to keep from fainting. Marcos leaned forward, his expression hardened. "Check the clock, Laura," Marcos pointed, his voice grim. "He stays inside for exactly 12 minutes. When Ricardo left, he was wiping his hands with a handkerchief. He didn't call anyone. He didn't rush off in search of a doctor. He simply walked toward the emergency exit, disappearing into the darkness of the corridor like a shadow retreating into the abyss. Less than 20 minutes later, the cardiac arrest alarm would sound, and the medical team would find Otavio lifeless. Terror settled in Laura's stomach, cold and cutting like an ice blade. Ricardo's betrayal wasn't just financial. It was no longer only about the altered will or the greed for control. What she had just witnessed was the visual record of a silencing. "He killed him," she whispered, tears finally overflowing, hot and bitter. "He didn't wait for nature to act, Marcos. He hastened the end." The silence in the monitoring room became oppressive. The hum of the machines now sounded like a muffled scream. Laura looked at her own hands, trembling and pale under the blue light. She had come looking for proof to contest a document, but she had found the trail of a monster who shared her DNA. Marcos placed his hand on her shoulder, a gesture of protection that seemed insufficient given the magnitude of what they had discovered. "This changes everything, Laura," he said, his voice low and loaded with a new urgency. "We're no longer dealing with an inheritance dispute. We are dealing with a murderer who thinks he got away with it. And if he realized Otavio was going to request that DNA test, he won't stop until all loose ends are cut." Laura looked once more at the static image of Ricardo on the screen. The face of the man she called brother was now the face of a stranger, a predator who shared the dinner table, who cried false tears at the funeral, and who, at that very moment, was probably sleeping the sleep of the righteous in his mansion. The hospital, with its white walls and endless corridors, seemed to be closing in on her. Every shadow now had Ricardo's shape. Every sound of footsteps was a threat. The visit to the hospital, which should have brought answers, brought a much more terrifying truth. Otavio's death was not an ending, but the beginning of a hunt where she, Laura, was the next prey. "Let's get out of here," she said, her voice now firm with a resolution born of pure desperation. "I want him to pay. Not for the money, not for the company, but for his look at that door. He knew what he was doing. And I will make sure he sees that video before he rots in jail." As they walked out into the cold, damp night, the air outside felt even heavier. Otavio's secret was no longer just in the grave. It was pulsing in Laura's veins, turning her grief into a thirst for justice that burned hotter than any pain. Ricardo's game had been perfect, but he made the mistake of underestimating the love of a daughter who had nothing left to lose but her own life. The silence in the Lacerda mansion was not peace, but a fetid stagnation, like stagnant water in a deep well. Laura crossed the entrance hall, her footsteps echoing on the cold marble, each beat of her heels sounding like a hammer striking a nail. The air smelled of expensive furniture wax and Helena's sickening floral perfume, which hung in the atmosphere like an invisible gas. In the living room, under the pale light of a crystal chandelier that seemed to weep glass drops, Ricardo and Helena were drinking wine. They looked like a painting of bourgeois perfection, if not for the almost imperceptible tremor in Ricardo's hands as he held the glass. "You took your time, darling," Helena said, without taking her eyes off the unlit fireplace. Her voice was silk concealing razors. Laura did not respond with words. She walked to the center of the Persian rug and tossed the brown envelope onto the coffee table. The sound of the paper hitting the wood was dry, definitive. Inside were the grainy frames from the hospital security cameras, proof that Ricardo had been in Otavio's room the moment life was draining from the old patriarch. Ricardo paled. The color fled his face, leaving behind a gray mask of dread. He looked at the envelope, then at Helena, and finally at Laura. "What is this, Laura?" He tried, but his voice failed, coming out as a hoarse whisper. "It's the end of your theater, Ricardo." Laura felt tears burn her eyes, but refused to let them fall. Her voice was pure steel. "I saw you. I saw you entering that room. My father was dying, and you were the last one to see him. What did you do? Did you turn off the machines? Did you suffocate him with your own betrayal?" Helena slowly rose, her elegance collapsing to give way to a defensive rigidity. "You don't know what you're talking about, girl. You're in shock. The pain is clouding your judgment." "Pain gave me perfect vision, Helena," Laura shouted, the sound ripping through the suffocating atmosphere of the room. "I know you wanted control of the company. I know he was the obstacle. But to kill him? To kill the man who gave you everything, Ricardo?" Ricardo let out a nervous laugh, a broken sound that chilled Laura's spine. He placed the glass on the table and walked to the window, watching the rain that was beginning to lash the panes. "He didn't give me anything, Laura," Ricardo said, his back to her. "He gave me scraps. He gave me the humiliation of living in his shadow while I watched what was mine be managed by a man who despised me." "What was yours?" Laura advanced, grabbing his arm, forcing him to turn. "He was my father. He loved me." Ricardo gripped Laura's wrists with a sudden, painful force. His eyes, once calm and seductive, were now pits of an ancient, toxic bitterness. "He didn't love you, Laura. In the end, he hated you more than he hated me." "Lie." Ottavio received a letter. Helena intervened, her voice now cold as ice. "An anonymous letter, weeks before he fell ill. And it was the proof I tried to burn for 20 years. Proof that the great love of his life, your late mother, had a secret." Laura felt the floor sway. The room seemed to spin, the oak walls closing in on her. "What are you talking about?" Laura's voice was a thread of hope about to break. Ricardo released her wrists and took a step back, as if her proximity burned him. "Ottavio discovered you were not his blood, Laura. He discovered that the perfect daughter, the heiress he so spoiled, was the fruit of the greatest betrayal he had ever suffered. He discovered that I am your biological father." The impact of those words was physical. Laura felt as if she had been hit by a sledgehammer in the chest. The air fled her lungs. She looked at Ricardo, searching for any trace of falsehood, any sign that this was just another cruel manipulation. But what she saw was a naked, devastating truth. The resemblance in the eyes, the curve of the chin, it was all there, hidden in plain sight for decades. "No," she whispered, stumbling. "He loved me. He raised me. He raised you to be his trophy," Ricardo said, his voice rising, loaded with a rancor he could no longer contain. But when he knew the truth, the love turned to venom. "He didn't just want to destroy me. He wanted to punish you. He was going to disinherit you, Laura. He was going to leave you on the street, penniless, nameless, without anything. He wanted you to feel the shame he felt knowing he raised his wife's lover's daughter." Laura leaned against the armchair, her legs giving way. The image of Ottavio, the man she idolized, transformed in her mind. She remembered his cold gaze in his last days in the hospital, the way he avoided touching her, the silence laden with contempt. It wasn't the illness that pushed him away, it was disgust. "I went into that room to save our future," Ricardo continued, approaching her, his voice now softened by a manipulative madness. "He was going to sign the exclusion papers that night. I didn't kill him, Laura. I just let him go. I watched him suffocate on his own hatred and didn't call anyone. I let fate do what he deserved for wanting to destroy his own daughter, my daughter." The term "my daughter" sounded like a profanation. Laura looked at Ricardo's hands, the hands she thought would protect her, the hands she now knew were the same ones that had touched her mother and had watched Ottavio die without lifting a finger. "You are a monster," Laura said, the tears finally overflowing, hot and bitter. "And he was a man broken by what you did. We are your family now, Laura," Helena said, approaching and trying to place her hand on the young woman's shoulder. "Ottavio is dead. The secret is buried. Now, we have control. All you have to do is accept who you are. Blood of our blood." Laura looked at the two of them. The mansion's luxury now seemed like a mausoleum. The blood running in her veins, the blood she once saw as noble and pure, now seemed dirty, contaminated by betrayal and crime. She wasn't the heiress of an empire. She was the result of a sin transformed into tragedy. "I am nothing to either of you," Laura said, standing up with a dignity that seemed to come from somewhere deep and unknown. "You can have the money. You can have the company, but you will never have my soul. She walked toward the door, the envelope with the photos still in her hand. Ricardo tried to stop her, but the look of pure hatred she threw at him made him freeze. Where are you going? Ricardo shouted. You have nowhere to go. You are nobody without the Lacerda name. Laura stopped at the threshold of the door, the rain now entering and wetting the marble. I'd rather be nobody than be one of you. She stepped out into the dark night, leaving behind the false warmth of the mansion and the bloody truth she had just unearthed. She was alone, without a father, without an inheritance, and without a past. But, for the first time in her life, Laura felt that her pain was, finally, only hers. The click of the lock echoed down the empty corridor like a shot of mercy. Laura leaned her back against the cold wood of Ottavio's bedroom door, her fingers still trembling, feeling the thin air of that sanctuary of secrets. His smell was still there, an oppressive mix of aged tobacco, armchair leather, and the woody cologne that, for 25 years, had been synonymous with safety for her. Now, that scent was a trigger for nausea. The room was plunged into a gray twilight. The faint light of the afternoon filtered through the heavy velvet curtains, illuminating the dust particles that danced in the air, indifferent to the collapse of Laura's world. She walked slowly, each step weighing as if she were dragging invisible chains. Her eyes, burning from contained crying, fixed on the oak wall where Ottavio's glories were displayed. There were the equestrian medals, the gold medal now opaque, reflecting a sickly light. Laura reached out and touched the cold glass of a silver photo frame. In the picture, a 7-year-old Laura smiled, gap-toothed and radiant, in the arms of a younger Ottavio, who squeezed her with a pride that seemed unshakable. A lie, she whispered, and her voice sounded like the crack of broken glass in the absolute silence of the room. Ricardo's revelation downstairs still throbbed in her temples. The blood running in her veins did not belong to the man in the photo. She was the living proof of Helena's betrayal, the fruit of a forbidden desire with Ricardo, the man she had been taught to respect only as a business ally. Ottavio had known. He had discovered the truth through that damned anonymous letter and, instead of confronting the adults, had decided to turn Laura's life into an emotional killing field. Laura felt her chest burn. The pain was not just for the loss of the father figure, but for the mutilation of her own identity. Who was she now? If they took Ottavio's surname and Ricardo's genetic inheritance, what was left? She felt like a page ripped from a book, floating without context, without a beginning, and with an end stained by blood and resentment. She approached Ottavio's desk. Resting on the green leather surface was a brass letter opener. Laura picked it up, feeling the weight of the object. Her eyes wandered to another photograph. Helena, her mother, in an emerald silk dress, her eyes gleaming with a malice Laura now recognized as fear disguised. Hatred bubbled up, hot and dense. She hated Helena for being a coward, for keeping the secret that acted like a silent cancer in the family. She hated Ricardo for his late confession, for claiming a paternity he never earned, using the truth as a weapon to destroy what remained of Ottavio's empire. But, above all, the deepest pain came from Ottavio. How could he? How could the man who read her bedtime stories, who held her hand when she had nightmares, look her in the eye all these years and see only the face of the enemy? Every gesture of affection from Ottavio now seemed like a perverse staging. He loved her while he thought she was his, but his love had a biological exclusivity clause. The moment the letter revealed the truth, Laura stopped being his girl to become the trophy of adultery. The silence of the room began to hum in her ears. It was the sound of emptiness. Laura sat in Ottavio's armchair, the leather creaking under her weight. She closed her eyes and, for a second, tried to evoke the feeling of being loved unconditionally. But the image that came was Ottavio's face in their last confrontation, cold, devoid of any trace of humanity, looking at her as if she were a broken object that needed to be discarded. She opened her eyes and fixed her gaze on the old dressing table mirror. The woman looking back at her had Ricardo's eyes and Helena's mouth, but the expression of desolation was purely hers. Laura felt a sudden urge to scream, to break every glass in that mansion, to set the curtains on fire and watch Ottavio's memories be reduced to ashes. Instead, she merely squeezed the letter opener against her palm until she felt the tip pierce the skin. A drop of blood, red and bright, welled up and trickled down the brass. This is their blood, she thought, watching the drop fall onto the Persian rug. But the pain is all mine. The internal conflict tore her apart. A part of her wanted to run into Ricardo's arms and demand the lost time, the protection a biological father should offer. Another part wanted to beg Ottavio's forgiveness, even knowing he didn't deserve it, just to have back the illusion of belonging somewhere. And there was Helena, the woman who carried her in her womb, but used her as a human shield against her husband's fury. Laura realized she was in the cruelest grief of all, the grief of herself. She was burying the Laura who believed she had a history, to make way for a Laura who was merely the result of a geographical and genetic error. Ottavio's room, once a safe haven, had become a cell of psychological torture. Every object, every medal, every photo was a silent witness to a masterful farce. She stood up, her legs wobbly. The weight of that house, of that rotten lineage, seemed to be collapsing on her shoulders. She walked to the window and threw open the curtains at once. The bright light blinded her for an instant. Outside, Ottavio's impeccable garden stretched out, vast and controlled. But Laura saw no beauty. She only saw the roots that, though deep, were all dead. She would no longer belong to that soil. But the price of freedom was the absolute emptiness of not knowing who, after all, she would find when the sun set over the ruins of her life. The air inside Ottavio's room seemed to have solidified, transforming into a dense, cold mass that made it difficult for Laura to breathe. The scent of sandalwood and pipe tobacco, the olfactory signature of the man she had called father all her life, still floated among the heavy velvet curtains, now permeated by the metallic odor of neglect and death. Laura pressed the brown envelope Marcos had handed her moments before against her chest. Inside it, Ottavio's original will pulsed like a torn heart, a document capable of reducing the empire built on lies to ashes. The door creaked. The sound was like a gunshot in the silence of the violated sanctuary. Ricardo entered first. He carried with him the arrogance of one who never needed permission to exist. His Italian leather shoes clicked against the wooden floor, a predatory rhythm that made Laura's nerves vibrate. Right behind, Helena stumbled in, a pale and fragmented shadow of the haughty woman she used to be. Her eyes were red, swollen from a crying that Laura could no longer identify as remorse or pure terror over what she was about to lose. "Get out of here." Laura's voice came out hoarse, a blunt blade scraping her throat. Ricardo didn't stop. He approached the oak desk, ignoring Ottavio's equestrian medals that Laura had been caressing. He turned to his biological daughter with a smile that didn't reach his eyes that were identically cold to hers. "Let's skip the dramatic staging, Laura," Ricardo said, his voice velvety and dangerous. "Marcos was efficient in retrieving that paper you're holding, but it's just that, paper. What matters now is reality. Ottavio is gone. The vacuum he left can be filled with gold or with mud. The choice is strictly yours." He took a step forward, and Laura backed up, hitting her back against the bookshelf. "I know what happened that night," Laura hissed, feeling the will's paper crumple under her trembling fingers. "I know what you did to ensure Ottavio didn't talk. You killed him, Ricardo. You killed him, and now you want to buy my silence." Helena let out a choked sob, covering her mouth with her thin hands, where diamonds shone like drops of ice. "Laura, please," Helena pleaded, her voice brittle. "Don't look at things that way. We did what was necessary to protect you, to bring you back where you belong. Your father, Ricardo, he can give you the world. Everything Ottavio promised you is a fraction of what you will have now. I just want your forgiveness. I just want to be your mother again." "Mother?" Laura laughed, a dry, humorless sound that echoed through the walls lined with photos of a childhood that now seemed like a hallucination. "You handed me over to him as if I were spoiled goods. You allowed Ottavio to raise me in a lie so you could maintain your life of luxury and your secrets buried. Where was that motherly love when I cried at night, not knowing why I didn't look like either of you?" Ricardo interrupted the sentimental moment with an impatient wave of his hand. "Your mother's forgiveness is an emotional luxury we don't have time to discuss. Let's talk business, which is the only language that survives time. If you hand me that will and swear loyalty to the family, I will make you the majority heiress of all my holdings. The silence regarding Ottavio's death will be absolute." No one will ever know he was moved. No one will question the medical reports. You will have his fortune and mine. You will be untouchable. He leaned in, the breath of mint and cold coffee hitting Laura's face. But, he continued, his tone dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, if you decide to use that document to try and destroy us, I will ensure you fall with us. I will say you were complicit. I will say Marcos and you planned everything to inherit sooner. In the end, Laura, the world believes whoever has the most power to print their own version of the truth. Laura looked at the will in her hands. Marcos had told her the document proved Otavio intended to disinherit any connection to Ricardo and leave everything to her, on the condition that she cut ties with her biological parents. It was the last wish of a man who, despite having stolen her identity, tried to protect her from the monster now standing before her. The visual discomfort of the scene was almost unbearable. The orange light of the sunset crossed the gaps in the blinds, creating streaks that looked like cell bars over Helena's body. The silence that followed Ricardo's threat was punctuated only by the frantic ticking of a wall clock that seemed to count the last seconds of Laura's soul. She looked at Helena, who was now kneeling, clutching the hem of Laura's dress. The touch was suffocating. Choose, Laura, Ricardo pressed, reaching out for the envelope. The loyalty that brings power, or the truth that brings ruin. What is worth more to you now that the sun is setting over the ruins of your life? Laura felt the weight of Otavio's medals on the shelf, the weight of the guilt of having loved a liar, and the weight of the hatred for those who shared her blood. She looked at the yellowed paper, feeling the power to destroy the reputation of everyone present, including her own. Her fingers began to tear the edge of the envelope, a sound that seemed like thunder in the empty room. The fate of a dynasty hung by a thread of cellulose and a decision made in the dark. The air in Otavio's office was saturated with the smell of antique mahogany and Helena's expensive floral perfume, which now, to Laura, seemed only the acrid scent of something decaying. The silence was a taut rope, ready to whip the face of anyone who dared to breathe too hard. Ricardo remained by the window, his silhouette silhouetted against the pale twilight, holding a crystal glass with whiskey that cost more than many people's lives. He exuded the predatory confidence of one who believes the world is a board where all the pieces, including people, have a price tag. Silence is the most precious metal there is, Laura. Ricardo's voice was a velvety whisper, devoid of any remorse. Sign the papers, accept your share, and let Otavio's name rest in peace. What happened that night was an error in judgment, a necessary fatality to keep this empire standing. Do you really want to be the person who brings down the pillars of the temple? Laura looked at her hands. They trembled slightly, not from fear, but from a chilling fury that ran in her veins like liquid nitrogen. In one hand, the original will that Marcos had recovered from the shadows, the document that gave her absolute control over the dynasty. In the other, hidden in her coat pocket, the small USB drive that contained the irrefutable evidence that Ricardo had orchestrated the death of the man she called father. Helena, sitting on the leather sofa, was a shadow of her former self. Her eyes, once haughty, were swollen and red. She reached out toward her daughter, a gesture of supplication that seemed staged, but carried the real desperation of someone who sees the abyss opening beneath their feet. Please, my daughter, for us. Don't destroy everything we built. I beg you for forgiveness. I didn't know. I didn't want it to come to this. Helena's voice broke, transforming into a dry sob that echoed off the cold walls of the room. Laura finally looked up. Her eyes met Ricardo's, and the man faltered for a millisecond. He saw something there that money could not buy, an integrity that bordered on cruelty. You talk about pillars, Ricardo, but you forget they were raised on Otavio's corpse, Laura said, her voice coming out firm, cutting like a glass blade. And you, Helena, talk about forgiveness as if it were a coin you could trade for my silence. You are not a family. You are parasites feeding on a legacy that never belonged to you. Without hesitation, Laura picked up the phone on the table. The sound of the keys being dialed sounded like a gunshot in the void. Ricardo stepped forward, his face suddenly disfigured by the threat, but Marcos, who was watching everything from the doorway with the expression of one who has finally found his moral compass, stepped into the way. It's over, Ricardo, Marcos said, his tone low and definitive. The arrival of the police was a blur of blue lights and sirens that tore through the oppressive stillness of the mansion. The sound of handcuffs closing on Ricardo's wrists was, for Laura, the purest music she had ever heard. The villain didn't scream. He just shot a look of pure hatred at Laura, a look that promised revenge, but which was now nothing more than the spasm of a cornered animal. Helena collapsed to the floor, a heap of silk and despair, as officers led her away to give a statement about her passive complicity. Weeks later, the media buzz still echoed, but Laura no longer inhabited that world. In a cold, impersonal conference room, she signed the final documents. Under the incredulous gaze of the lawyers, Laura renounced every penny of the billionaire inheritance. She didn't want the buildings, the stocks, the jewelry, or the properties. To her, every gold coin was stained with Ottavio's blood, and she refused to build her life on a cemetery of secrets. The final act of her liberation took place under a leaden sky, in a cemetery where the wind blew with a cutting melancholy. The sound of her steps on the damp gravel was the only noise. Laura stopped before the white marble tomb where Ottavio's name was engraved imposingly, but solitarily. She knelt down, feeling the dampness of the grass penetrate the fabric of her pants. The cold was intense, but her chest burned with a clarity she had never felt before. Laura placed a single white rose on the cold stone. The contrast of the immaculate petal against the gray marble was a reflection of her own soul after the storm. They tried to convince me that blood is what defines a person, Ottavio, she whispered, and the tears finally came, warm and liberating, streaming down her face. They told me that because I didn't have your DNA, I wasn't yours. But they forgot that blood is only useful for pumping the heart. What united us was something no will or crime could destroy. She touched the cold surface of the tombstone with her fingertips, feeling the texture of the stone. You were the only father I ever had. The only one who truly saw me. I gave up everything they call wealth so that your name could, finally, belong only to the truth. Rest now. The dynasty is over, but your love? I carry that with me, and it doesn't cost a cent. Laura stood up. The wind blew harder, tousling her hair, but she didn't flinch. She walked toward the exit, leaving behind the empire of shadows, Helena's betrayals, and Ricardo's wickedness. Ahead of her, the horizon was cloudy, uncertain, and empty of financial guarantees. But, for the first time in her life, Laura breathed air that was entirely her own. She was poor in money, but she possessed something none of those left in the mansion would ever know: the absolute peace of one who owes nothing to the dead, except honor.